So, we have stuff in your database, and you want to keep track of when things happen to that stuff that's in your database. Maybe you've got songs, you want to track when they get played, or website users, and you want to track when they've changed their preferences or things like that. Maybe recipes, and you have a cookie recipe, and you want to remember that, this time it was tasty because you remembered to put in the sugar. DBIx class events is a DBIc component for tracking when things happen, that stuff that's in your database. We call those events. It's pretty easy to add additional metadata of what do you want to track. By default, we track create, update, and delete events, and it writes down what columns changed. And there's a helper to calculate what the state was at any particular point in time. It obviously can't deal with direct database mods and trigger on bulk updates. Those are limitations of the DBIx class. But for our case, it's really good enough for what we needed it to do. We augment it in our Catalyst models to automatically find the logged in user and the request ID for that request so that we can add that tracking information to the event and have a little more detail. But other things could be events. Maybe a user agreed to specific terms of service and you want to keep track of when that happened. We use it internally for one of our auctions products that tracks when a user enters or submits a bid, and then we can build replays via that calculated state to show what the auction looked like at any particular point in time. I'm happy to talk to you all lots of times about a lot about how this module works and all of that later, but I'm really going to talk about what it took to get it open sourced, because I really would have probably used DBIx class audit any, as complicated as that module is, except that it was released to the CPAN about 2 months after my first commit to the internal version of this. So it was there, just not soon enough for me to use it. And that was really disappointing because I don't like to write software if I don't have to. So I was really interested in having a culture of sharing code at work. And getting other folks to share stuff was really important, and not just me sharing it. And that's not what we had. So I created this thing, a different thing. And then I announced it and told everybody about it. And somebody else at work said, "Oh, I wrote that too." It just had a really bad name, and I didn't realize that I could have used it. And it was like exactly the same thing I wrote. And so after I had kind of realized that this was a problem, I started paying attention, and I found lots of cases where we had code that we had written internally, and maybe it was stuck in somebody's app, and so it was buried deep inside of the app's code, or maybe it was just poorly named, or part of another shared module undocumented, and so I didn't know I could reuse it. I'm Andrew Hughes-Fresh. I've been a developer at Grant Street for 7.5 years now. I'm a fan of open source. One of my free time projects is keeping Perl up to date in OpenBSD. But Grant Street has always been a company that embraces open source. But over time, they've developed this culture of building silos. And so in this talk, I'm going to take all the credit since I'm giving the talk. But lots of real work was done by other folks like Mark. I'm very fortunate to be at work to be able to argue my obviously correct opinion, and eventually to have folks listen to what I say. My team manages about a dozen different applications using multiple different frameworks. So flexible, reusable, shared code really benefits me a lot personally. Some of the other teams at work only work on a single app, and a lot of times it's multiple teams that are working on a single app. And so their problems are a lot of times easier to solve just by putting the code directly into the application and solving it that way, but that doesn't really help me, and so that means we needed to change. Back in 2016, I gave an internal lightning talk about why we might want to devote more time to doing open source and putting stuff out there and such. It was, of course, giving back to the community that gives us so much. And that, of course, builds goodwill with that community, which is where we look for employees. And when employees come in and they ask, and we're going to probably ask them about their open source contributions and their GitHub account, and they're going to ask that back to us as well, and we want to have a good answer. Of course, when outside people are looking at our code, we want to impress them, and so we're going to hopefully spend a little more time improving it and making sure that it really works well, more so than we might do if it was just solving this one tiny problem. And that, of course, leads to what I think turns out to be better software. Unfortunately, good ideas aren't quite enough. People are busy. Some people have things they care about more than open source. Like having me go away and stop talking to them about it. We actually had a step before this. Whoa. No. Okay. So we actually had a step before this. In 2014, we had some 16-hour company-wide hackathons, which is not quite enough time, it turns out, to really get anything done, so we stopped doing those. This is not our hackathon. I didn't have a picture of ours, so I found one on the internet. Brendan Bird at work and I, mostly him, tried to open source one of the good parts of an internal module back at this hackathon, and it didn't actually get open source. We didn't run out of time on it. But we did give a talk internally about it and why we thought sharing was good way back in 2014. And we asked, why aren't we doing more of this? And the answer turned out to be it was just too hard to do. Since then, Brendan and several other people have released stuff, both to GitHub and to the CPAN. But this was all through this really old process that we had that was really difficult. And my real goal wasn't to release my stuff to the CPAN. It was to get other people who weren't necessarily super interested to share their stuff. So this was so difficult because our internal processes were really different from how open source software really works. And that was kind of because they grew up at the same time as open source, because Grant Street is one of those, has been around since really early Perl. And what works at a small company with maybe a couple dozen developers does not work as we've grown and grown and grown. In the 7.5 years that I've been there, we've now doubled in size. And of course, that workflow doesn't work in an open source project or community. Our installation method, module installation methods in particular, were very special and very hard to work with. And if you found somehow that somebody had shared some code internally, and so you wanted to use that, actually doing that was super terribly difficult and hard to do. And then if you wanted to update it, it was hard again to actually do that. So it was really easy to point to Carton and CPAN-M and the Meta CPAN and show how much better it could be and what things worked really well outside of our company. And so it was easy to get buy-in to try that out. And so we got a dark pan, and that let us use some standard tooling to install modules and this Meta CPAN front end that let folks search for things that they wanted to, that they could use, and link to documentation and to specific points in the code at a different version, and be able to just share that. And that was so powerful, and it ended up being a really great success. And I think it's really encouraging people to write better code or write better documentation because it's much easier for people to read and to go see what it's doing. So now we have this dark pan, and I had several of these new modules that I was working on creating at the time, and I wanted everybody else to be able to create stuff more easily too. Another thing that was a problem is that for legacy reasons, creating a new internal Git repository was amazingly difficult. You could cut some unofficial corners, and you could probably get one in 24 hours. If you're working on a module that's going to take a short amount of time, that's not very. So I made sure, though, that I followed the correct procedure, and as all the people who were doing the work they shouldn't have to do were doing it, I reminded them they shouldn't have to do it, and that it should be much easier than this. So now we've got a chat up spot, and so you go into chat and you say, give me a new Git repo, and now you've got a new Git repo in about very few seconds. A side benefit of that is that this bot can do other things too for us that we didn't have before anyway. So now now it's super easy. So in 2017, I gave a longer talk internally about expanding on the benefits of sharing stuff, but instead of focusing on my ultimate goal of open sourcing things, I talked mostly about the benefits of just sharing code in general inside of the company. And this turned out to be a key way to get buy-in for sharing things. Because sharing things inside the company is an easier sell. Because both sides, when somebody shares something, the people that benefit from what's shared are employees. But it turns out that many of the same things that come from sharing internally also apply to open sourcing it. For example, I don't want to rewrite it. If it exists, that's one of the great things about looking at the CPAN. And of course, when you're thinking about sharing something, you're hopefully going to make it so that it's easier to understand. You're going to write better documentation and things like that. And you might think about how other people are going to use it. And rather than writing a specific solution for your problem, you might make something that's a little bit more general and applicable to more people. And then when you've got these black boxes of shared code that works, that means there's less code in your app that you have to look at and recognize and realize and understand. And so you don't have to really understand all of these black boxes of shared code. So I showed off some of about a half dozen of these different internal modules that I've written that they shouldn't have to use, or that they shouldn't have to understand, they could just use, and showed how writing them that way and making them shared made my life easier, and how it was making their lives easier because they were now a lot of times using them even if they didn't know it. Because we have a really high adoption rate on that set of modules because it was something that everybody in the company needed. And I think that was a great testament to how well sharing code works. And I offered some advice on what I thought makes code good and then why I thought sharing would encourage those traits for good code. I said easy to write code is great, and that saves you time now. That's a benefit of Perl. But if you instead write it so that it's easy to use, that saves everyone who's going to use it time later. And saving a one-person time is great, but saving lots of people time is better. Writing more documentation and clearer, better documentation means that the folks you're sharing with get stuff done without bothering you. There's so many benefits to testing that I didn't have that much time in my talk. If you remember, the lack of a good name was kind of what got me started on this path of improving sharing. So that's a very important piece of it. And of course, more eyes on the code mean more people are going to find bugs, or at least there's a theory that says that. And I talked a little bit about how our internal code that wasn't shared was failing at a lot of these points, and how I thought sharing would help. And the biggest thing I find for making good code is to make small pieces that do one thing and do it well, because you can understand them. And the less the code does, the easier it is to document, the easier it is to write tests for, and the more likely I think that it's going to be something that's generic enough that you can reuse it. So we were already looking at improving our workflows, and so I made sure to be involved in the different discussions about the workflows for shared modules that were going on, and pointing to the successes of open source projects that were using different workflows, and using that as a good argument for doing something similar internally. And so when we adopted these kind of similar workflows to what works in open source, and we've already started open sourcing or sharing some of these modules internally, it's easier to spot modules that we've shared internally that could be open sourced, or when new things are being written, spotting that they can be, because with the right tools to reduce the friction of where the code lives, it's really easy to use those benefits I mentioned before about open source to argue for that tiny little hurdle of filling out a form that says we're allowed to open source it, and that's the only hurdle. I created the Distilla plugin bundle first to make it easy to work with code that lives on GitHub and then publish stuff to the CPAN. And then I took that and I built a subclass of that for our internal use. And so now it uses the exact same workflow internally as for publishing to GitHub with no difference. So, and for the person who's using it, there's really no difference. There are a few things that still need to be done, but obviously, always. Anyway, I also made an internal distilla minting profile for creating dists for both of these modules, so other people can create them fairly easily. Anyway, to sum up, I think sharing code encourages really the best parts of all of these virtues. With laziness, someone else will probably find and maybe even fix bugs in your code. I've already had pull requests and issues filed for DBIx class events. New hires that we hire are more likely to be familiar with our code, with the tools we use and the code that we have, if it's out there on the CPAN, or out there open anyway. If somebody else figured out how to do something and they put it into a shared module, that means I don't have to understand some API somewhere. Hopefully they made it so that they know how to talk to it. I don't have to figure something out. And hopefully they made it much easier to use so that I can just do it. And those are all benefits to my laziness. As far as impatience, Distilla is the ultimate in impatience. Yeah. So, better reusability of code, being able to just focus on the thing you want to build and grab pieces of generic components that you can just put together to build the thing you want. That's so much better than having to write everything from scratch. Being able to improve things all in one place, to change the implementation of a shared module and improve everybody's life, that's so much better than going and rewriting it everywhere. And if outside people are going to see it, you want to be proud of it. So you're going to write better documentation so that they choose to use it. You're going to write more tests because you don't want to break their stuff. And you're going to write clearer code so that when they do find problems with it and they go and look in it, everybody at the conference that you're at looks at it and says, hey, I like that code you wrote. And if your peers think you're good at stuff, who doesn't want that validation? So while DBIx class events is the first module really to come out of these changes, we're fairly well committed to that now. I don't give Mark any other options. So anyway, we have time for some questions and answers. And the first answer is yes, Grant Street is hiring. And yes, they paid me to say that. grantstreet.com/careers. So. Any questions? Jim.
Yes, you said that you've been working there 7.5 years, and you began this discussion towards open sourcing, I believe you said about 3 years ago, right? Does that imply that they really wouldn't have paid you much attention if you had raised those in, say, your first 2 years there? And the reason I ask that is that was my experience.
Yes and no. I apparently skipped over that slide or something. Apparently it was one of the ones that clicked too fast. But I mentioned in my practice runs that I have experience with culture change at work. I remember the first change set that or the first review I was allowed to fail because it didn't include tests. And that was one of the things that when I started was not a thing. Tests were like, if you want to write them, fine. But I was like, that doesn't seem right. So it took me, so I started right away kind of pushing towards making testing a thing. And I think it took probably 3 years, I would guess, before I was actually allowed to fail that for that reason. And that was just having to convince other people and to say, this is making them think it's their idea, I guess, and making it important to them because culture change is not fast. it takes a while for things to change, and you have to be patient and really keep repeating yourself.
Question for you. Dark pan, is that an internal CPAN?
Yeah, it's an internal CPAN. It's ours is called the GSG pan, but a dark pan is I guess more generic name for it. We use, I don't know what it is on the back end.
I think it's just a fork of like MetaCPAN, Lab MetaCPAN API, and then Pinto server.
Pinto server, that was the thing I couldn't think of. The question was, what is a dark pan? I wrote a note to remember to repeat the question, but that wasn't good enough.
Is there a decent blog out there for setting something like that up? Right from.
I don't know, because there's more than one way to do it. So we chose this way. I know that there are some. Pinto is the name of the back-end thing that does it. There are some other options. I wasn't too involved in the details of why Mark did any of the things he did.
I just maintain.
So, anyway, I'll answer some more questions while next person's getting set up, I guess. Wow.
Thank you.
Huh? Thank you.